Thank you all for coming. This is another one of our series of covering what is happening in the region in general, but what is happening in Egypt in particular. The last week was eventful in Egypt with the referendum and the start of a process towards gradual change in that country. But beyond, we're of course witnessing what is happening in Libya. We've seen what has happened in Tunisia. And indeed, there's a wave that seems to be moving across the Arab world that promises to be quite transformational. I'm very delighted to have with us today someone who is known to all of you. I'm sure Lisa Anderson was appointed president of the American University of Cairo in January of this year. I was supposed to attend her inauguration, but of course, other events stood in the way. But even before Dr. Anderson went to Cairo, of course, she has been a specialist on the Middle East for a very, very long time. She served, of course, as the university's provost, AUC's provost, from 2008 to 2010. But prior to that, she was the Dean of International and Public Affairs at Columbia for 10 years. She's the author of many books and articles, The Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science and Public Policy in the 21st Century, The State and Social Transformations in Tunisia and Libya, 1830 to 1980, and editor of Transitions to Democracy and co-editor of The Origins of Arab Nationalism. Dr. Anderson will talk to us today about the events not just in Egypt, but also in Tunisia and Libya. As you all know, AUC is right on Tahrir Square, so we're getting a very unique perspective on events in that country as well as in the region. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anderson.
Thank you very much. It is a delight to be here. This is the first time I've been out of Egypt since the beginning of January, and so it's an interesting opportunity for me to get a different perspective than my own from Tahrir Square on what has been happening in the region. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the sort of larger picture of how we think about the authoritarian legacies of the regimes against which these rebellions were made, because I think, in fact, the tendency to see all of this of a piece is, on the one hand, understandable, but also potentially a significant mistake if you're thinking about policy approaches in the various countries in which we see these kinds of uprising. So I want to give a brief overview of that kind, and then I will entertain questions, including questions about what AUC has been doing, about what life on the square was like during the protests there, about the prospects for change, particularly in Egypt. But I do want to sort of set the stage, if you will, in a little bit more abstract and broader way. I think it's clear that certainly in the early days of the uprisings, at the beginning of this calendar year, people tended to see these, quote, Arab uprisings as all of a piece. And it is certainly true that they were largely unexpected, spontaneous protests against aging authoritarian rulers in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Libya, and now, as we are seeing increasingly elsewhere as well. And many of us had for a long time wondered how the next generation would take power in these countries. And at least in a few places, we seem to have the answer. It is through these popular uprisings. The contempt for their own citizens that had been conveyed by a lot of these governments for decades, they had seemed indifferent to the well-being of their own citizens. They seemed to have lost touch with the populations that they were putatively responsible for. And in all that respect, this is, as people often say, a set of protests about dignity, about citizens who, as they themselves put it, lost their fear and wanted to demand the respect that they thought they deserved from their own governments. And I think it's important to understand that that is, in many important ways, the framing of this. This is not particularly ideological. It's not particularly about, socialism or nationalism or ideologies of any kind. It is about simple issues of wanting governments that are respectful of the people they're supposed to serve and accountable to them. And one of the things that I think was noticeable over the last decade or so in a number of countries, and this is a sort of word picture, if you will, about the decay of the relationship between governments and their citizens in many of these countries, was the accumulation of garbage in the streets. And I was astonished when I was last in Libya, which was in 2007, by the extent to which this oil-rich country was filthy, absolutely filthy. So it wasn't about poverty. It wasn't about how one could, manage public services and so forth and so on. This was a country in which the citizens themselves, the people, were expressing contempt for their government and dissatisfaction with their own situation by throwing garbage in the streets. And they openly acknowledged that. Because obviously, when you visit a country and you see, particularly a wealthy country, garbage all over the place, you can hardly resist inquiring about how that has come to be. And people would say, we don't care, we just throw it in the streets. The interesting thing is that the government didn't pick it up. It was a mutual contempt. It was a sense of, just, all right, we all live in a pig pen and we don't care. And it was that kind of demoralization that ultimately animated these sorts of protests. And you can see the other side of that when you see what's happened in the aftermath of the protests in Egypt, where the place is spotless, where every single young person has been cleaning and painting the bridges and painting sidewalks and so forth and so on. And I don't know whether you've seen these pictures, but across the country, there is a cleanup campaign. And it is, once again, sort of emblematic of being tired of living in a circumstance in which it just didn't feel clean. And whether you mean that literally or whether you mean that metaphorically, there was too much corruption, so forth and so on, there is a sense that part of what this is about is citizens wanting to live in a circumstance in which they are respected by their governments, where their rights are acknowledged as citizens, and where they have responsibilities that are also acknowledged, including things like keeping things clean. Simple points that most people in other societies, including the one we're in right now, sort of take for granted. But I wanted to paint that word picture at the outset because I think it is important for those of us who are analysts here to keep in mind that when we say these are not particularly ideological, they are ideological in the sense that this is a generation of people who think their governments are there to serve them, who think that they should be respected by those governments, who think that those governments should be accountable to them, but are not swept up in ideological movements of any kind. And I think there is a generational change in the region in that respect, as well as in how they organize themselves and the importance of Facebook and social media and that kind of thing. Their parents were ideologues in ways that they are not. And I think we will see that bear fruit over the course of the coming years. That said, the patterns of how these protests develop, the kinds of things that were the specific targets of protest, are actually quite different in the three countries that I want to talk about, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And it's important to note that, as I said, because I think some of the policy prescriptions that we will see developing in the countries themselves as well as outside will reflect these sorts of differences. In Tunisia, one of the things that is, I think, worth remarking is that the protests started in the hinterlands. They started in the rural areas, in areas of Tunisia that were particularly neglected by a government that was extraordinarily good at painting a picture of a successful middle-income country that had, welcome tourism and so forth and so on, a picture that really was a Potemkin village, behind which there was quite a bit of misery, quite a bit of unhappiness, quite a bit of, as it turned out, resentment against a government whose center and whose ruler was unconscionably corrupt. Now, that suggests that there's a way to be conscionably corrupt, and perhaps there isn't, but in this case, it was really, really predatory in a way that was deeply insulting and offensive to many of the people who were actually in the hinterlands, outside what part of the country was enjoying any prosperity at all. And there was a sense that the government, the people around Ben Ali particularly, had taken dishonesty to an art form. There was very, very little discussion and debate, although we tend to think of all of these regimes as having been repressive of free expression. In Tunisia, despite their image as a modern country and one that could host UN conferences on information technology and so forth and so on, it was actually a very, very tightly controlled, far more than was the case in Egypt, for example. And it meant that there was a facade that everyone understood to be no more than a facade of this sort of modern, Western-facing, as I say, middle-income developing country. The corruption in Tunisia was very much organized at the top. The President Ben Ali and his family were routinely described, as Tunisians talked about politics and corruption, as the family, and everybody knew that the family got a cut of any significant economic transaction in the country, including any foreign investment. And there are multiple stories of foreign companies after considerably long negotiations deciding not to do business in Tunisia because they simply could not get through the family. And it was a quality of corruption and a quality of predatoriness that, as I say, was not only inhibiting the kind of development that the Tunisian regime claimed that they were promoting, but it was also deeply humiliating. There was, as a result, a family at the top. And keep in mind, when you talk about that family, Ben Ali himself had 7 brothers and sisters, and his wife had 10 brothers and sisters. So it was a very large family and sat very heavily on this kind of economy. So there was very little genuine sense of economic development, genuine sense that this was a set of policies that were designed to foster the prosperity of the country as a whole. It felt like it was designed to foster prosperity of a particular family. And as I say, partly as a result of that, the revolt started in the hinterlands, the furthest away from the family and the furthest away from the beneficiaries of the system, and spiraled toward the center, ultimately joined and supported by the long repressed but still fairly well organized labor unions. So you see a movement starting at the periphery and moving toward the center, both economically, geographically, politically, in all respects. The interesting thing about the quality of corruption in Tunisia, and as I say, for some of us, making distinctions among different kinds of corruption may be a fine point that is unpleasant, but I think it's not insignificant. The quality of the middle to low level administration in Tunisia was actually retained a fair amount of technocratic expertise. The corruption, as I am going to suggest in Egypt, was of a different quality. So the prospects for Tunisia to retain and build on a relatively strong bureaucratic apparatus, state administration throughout the country, I think are quite good. Today, there are obviously, as you know, debates about a successor regime that continue apace. There was a fair amount of uncertainty and instability in the transition. The Tunisians, having gone first in this, were the most surprised, the least equipped to think about what kind of government would be an appropriate transition from Ben Ali to some more permanent successor regime. The army did not support the government, but neither did it agree to rule. And I think part of what's interesting about the role of different armies, and we can talk about this later if you like, is that the only army that we're talking about in these three cases that actually saw genuine combat experience was the Egyptian army. And I think as a result of that, they're very reluctant to get into what they would call mission creep. They're not interested in sustaining their role in the political realm, but I get ahead of myself a little. I think the prospect of a loyal opposition in Tunisia is actually fairly high. I think the labor movement can begin to represent a loyal opposition. And one of the things that has been characteristic of these authoritarian regimes was that there was never any space for the idea, much less the appearance of a loyal opposition. Either you supported the government or you were betraying the country. And what we need to see in most of these countries is the existence and building up and stability of a loyal opposition where you can debate policy without necessarily being seen as a traitor to the country as a whole. And I think so, in some respects, I think Tunisia has some assets, the strength of its administration, the existence of a labor movement, which is likely to be able to play a role either as the government or as the loyal opposition. And I think the fact that Tunisia faces relatively straitened circumstances is probably going to mean that they collect information more effectively, they budget more effectively, and so forth, than they might if they were less constrained in financial terms. We can return to those propositions later if you want. Egypt, then, saw the next of the really significant uprisings. And as you all know, these were very urban. In contrast to the Tunisian case, the uprisings, the protests were not only in Cairo and not only downtown Cairo. There were significant uprisings in Alexandria and in Suez and so forth. But these are large provincial cities. This was an urban phenomenon. And one of the things that is a consequence of that is, of course, among many others, the outcome of the referendum on the constitutional amendments, because the only people that voted no were the people who had been, for all intents and purposes, in Tahrir Square. It was very urban. If you look at the patterns of the support for the constitutional amendments, in the rural areas, it was practically 100%. So the people who were prepared to be politically active and prepared to challenge the military were almost entirely what you might call the intelligentsia in the urban areas. But what you also saw, in addition to the fact that it was urban, was an extremely highly disciplined protest movement. And there was, and there remains, a reluctance on the part of the people who organized these movements to really surface as its leaders. And in that respect, that is I wouldn't say an ideological position, it's a principled position on their part that they are part of the people, they are not leaders and so forth and so on, so they don't want to surface, at least at this juncture. But I think what's really important about this is that that served them well as protest organizers. It does not necessarily serve them well after the protest has succeeded. And I think it's fair to say that the people who organized the protest, as they got going in the beginning of January and as they organized the January 25th Police Day protests, they did not expect to prevail. They had organized protests in the past that had fizzled out. They learned lessons in that. They learned a lot about civil disobedience, nonviolent protests, and so forth. But they did not expect that they would be confronted with success in the way they had. So they were extremely good at the protesting and now are finding themselves ill-equipped and unprepared for actually managing their political position in the new Egypt. That said, they were prepared for the opportunity when it presented themselves and very well networked and very sophisticated in not only getting, I think, we debate this. We sit in Egypt and say, well, was it 800,000 people? Was it 1 million people? Quite a lot of people to Tahrir Square for quite a long time. In a context where they were sufficiently well organized that they were not provoked by the thugs and saboteurs who were trying to make it violent. It was we can talk more about what happened in Tahrir Square, but it was a very, very sophisticated capacity to rally the troops, keep them there, keep them engaged, keep them peaceful. And hence you saw almost a festival atmosphere develop over the course of time. And some of that was a deliberate effort to ensure that it was peaceful and that it was possible to sustain it for what turned out to be several weeks. The authoritarianism, I think, that this protest actually revealed was not the kind of predatory regime that we saw in Tunisia, but actually an authoritarianism born more of neglect. That over the course of time, the regime just got out of touch, stopped thinking about a lot of the kinds of things that ordinary people care about, so that over the course of time, things in Egypt, whether it's, education or basic social services or salaries or anything, are formally very, very cheap. The formal wages are very low for the police, for example. Teachers get paid a pittance. But everybody supplements their salary with something that could be described as corrupt. So the small scale bribes to the police, the private lessons that all the teachers give in order for students to be prepared for exams. Everybody has a second job and a second source of income. And so, in fact, things in Egypt are kind of expensive. It's actually hard to get a lot of the social services that you are putatively have as a matter of right. It's hard to, you don't get, there is no such thing as free education, even though education is free, because you have to pay for the private lessons. So all of that, so there's a kind of pervasive small-scale corruption that is born of a failure to keep pace with inflation in wage rates for teachers, or keep pace with inflation in wage rates for police, or the huge 6 million civil servants that there are in Egypt. They're all underpaid, and they all have some other source of income. So one of the real challenges for Egypt is not so much removing a predatory family, although there are accusations, I think, largely unfounded against the Mubarak family, but the real challenge is to reform a 6 million person public bureaucracy so that people are paid enough that they don't need to supplement that, and then they stop supplementing it. That's going to be very complicated. It's not probably impossible to do, but it's a very different challenge than the challenge that the Tunisian reformers will be facing. I do think the effects of neglect in Egypt are going to be harder to reverse than removing the predatory family, the effects of neglect in Egypt than removing the family in Tunisia. But as I say, the debate on the future, the extent to which this is organized around a very, very simple, what would be familiar to any suburban American, safe and clean neighborhoods campaign, is in many respects very appealing, and there is an enormous amount of sort of enthusiasm and mobilization about taking responsibility. So, as I say, people are cleaning up their neighborhoods that hadn't been cleaned by anyone because the government wasn't doing it and the local residents weren't doing it. So suddenly people are cleaning up their neighborhoods. Suddenly people, as you undoubtedly saw when the police disappeared, these neighborhood watches appeared of local citizens taking responsibility for their own security and so forth and so on. That impulse of saying, yes, we are a citizen of this neighborhood, not only this country, and we want to be a citizen, we want to be held responsible, we want to be accorded that kind of responsibility, that change in the way Egyptians are seeing their interactions with each other and with the public authorities, I think, is quite remarkable and does bode well over the long run for a transition that does it does capture a sense of and reinforce a sense of responsibility on the part of many of the citizens. I think it's fairly clear that the military that did, of course, step in and manage the transition, Mubarak's departure, does not want to stay. I think a lot of the vote for yes for the constitutional amendments was not about the constitutional amendments, but it was for the military's timeline that they get out quickly, So one of the things that's interesting in contexts like this, and this was true when all of the left voted for Fox in Mexico, there's a lot of strategic, I don't necessarily agree with this, but I want the consequences. So I think a lot of people didn't even know what the constitutional amendments were, but they were voting, one, because they could vote, and they didn't know what the outcome was going to be, and that in itself was exciting. And two, because they thought if they voted yes, this was a way of not insulting the military and ensuring that they did leave promptly as they had promised to do. We can talk more about the prospects for the character of the transition if you want, but I think there is ample reason. I certainly, sitting in Cairo, am very optimistic about the prospects of a choppy, complicated, not easy, but nonetheless ultimately successful transition in Egypt. Libya, by contrast, I could not be more pessimistic about. The ragtag band of rebels that appeared in the eastern province, animated by the enthusiasm and the lack of fear demonstrated by the young people in both Tunisia and Egypt, are completely uncoordinated, as you can tell now, even internally, much less with other rebels in other parts of the country. There is, and has been for decades, virtually no free information available in Libya about what's going on in Libya, much less in the rest of the world. So most of what Libyans know about each other is unreliable and incomplete. And there's very little capacity to coordinate. So the sort of discipline and organization you saw among the Egyptians is not something you see among the Libyans, because for the last 30 years, the regime in Libya has deliberately and relatively successfully prevented the growth of bureaucracy, of professional middle classes, of nationwide networks of economic ties, civic organizations, political institutions, anything. So what you see now is, and you hear these reports all the time about tribes and tribalism in Libya. This is a sort of renewed or induced tribalism, because one of the few reliable sources of solace and support in a context like Libya's was family. So tribal ties had begun to attenuate 50 or 60 years ago, had become less important as people had professional identities and so forth. Robbed of any capacity to have those kinds of identities in any effective way, people then resorted to family, because the only way you could get access to the kinds of social services you needed, or education, or other kinds of permissions to do things in Libya was actually through those kinds of connections. So what's interesting about what you would call corruption in Libya is that it demonstrates that there has to be something public which is turned to private sources, private purposes. That's sort of the definition of corruption in some sense. In this instance, there's no public. It is, at this point, Gaddafi and his revolution and his ideological supporters and his family, and that's all. So people have, it's hard to argue that the way people have behaved and the extent to which they've relied on their own families for access to the kinds of daily needs that we all have constitutes corruption, when there wasn't any alternative to that at all. All of this means, in my estimation, that the post-Gaddafi reconstruction is going to be far more about state formation than about democratic transition. I think we are starting behind zero in terms of the construction of a nationwide state administration that would be recognized by all Libyans as having any legitimacy. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. I think there are regional tensions that are long-standing and have grown over the course of time. The East was always relatively sullen under Gaddafi, and it's no surprise that that's where the protests started. But it's also true that you've seen a lot of fairly opportunistic, quote, tribes moving toward the rebels, and when the rebels' fortunes looked bad, they moved toward the government and so forth and so on. There's a lot of opportunism because there is no ideological commitment of any kind at this point, except opposition to Gaddafi among those people who think that they can get away with it. And I think that's really the question mark now, is whether that opposition will be able to get away with being in opposition. One of the things that Gaddafi has said, and I think he is in most respects a man of his word, is that he will die a martyr to the revolution. So unlike Ben Ali, who was exiled from Tunisia, but survives, or Mubarak, who wasn't even required to leave the country, but just went off to his home in Sharm el-Sheikh, Gaddafi is going to be, if in fact the rebels prevail, will be killed and his body will be dragged through the streets so that people know he's really dead. There is that quality to the tension. Nobody is going to give up this fight because they know that if they surrender, they'll be killed, so they might as well die in battle. Nobody on either side, or perhaps on any side, believes there is any merit or value or prospect in surrender. So it is going to be a bloodbath in many ways, and I think that was and remains the challenge for people who look in from the outside, saying this is, of course, in part at least, a case of the new United Nations doctrine on the responsibility to protect civilians and so forth, but at the same time, it is also, like these other protests against authoritarian rules, not simply an issue of civilians. This is what could be described as a civil war. And if you put your thumb on the scale in trying to protect civilians, you are actually taking sides in a war. That may be fine. It certainly was, I think, part of the calculus of the Arab League. They knew perfectly well what they were doing. Gaddafi is one of the most unpopular people in the Arab world in the view of the Arab League, so there was no love lost there. But those are the kind of calculations that the international community are going to have to live with as this resolves itself, however it does. So in sum, there are very different kinds of non-democratic settings and therefore very different kinds of protests against those non-democratic regimes. And it behooves us to disaggregate them one from the other and start thinking about what the prospects for various kinds of policy regimes in the aftermath of the fall of an authoritarian regime may be. And as I suggested, I think we have two cases where we can have reasonable cause for optimism. I'm particularly optimistic about Egypt, but that's because I live there, I think. I think if I was living in Tunis, I'd probably be pretty optimistic about Tunisia too. But it's certainly, I think it's going to be hard in Egypt, but I think it's got a good shot at being a much more open, dynamic society and polity than it has been in recent years. One of the things, however, that is, and I'll stop here and entertain your observations, that I think we do need to be concerned about is the cost that Libya may represent to Tunisia and Egypt. And it would be very much too bad if those countries, preoccupied as they should be with sorting out their internal issues, end up being asked to be, much less actually doing anything in Libya, because you can see the temptation from the rest of the world. They're neighbors, they care, they know, and so forth and so on. On the other hand, they're very, very busy. And if they succeed in any way to develop something that approximates democracy, it would be so hugely valuable to the region as a whole that it's worth being abstemious about asking them to do anything in or for Libya. And on that note, perhaps I can stop and we can talk about Tahrir Square if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. I'm going to use my privilege as the moderator and ask the first question if I can. Is there any emerging trend that we can see in Egypt on a new system? Are Egyptians thinking of a parliamentary system, a presidential system, or is it too premature to talk about such trends? And maybe a couple of words on the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Well, as I said, one of the interesting aspects about Egypt right now is that people did not expect to be in this position. So if you would ask any Egyptian on the 25th of January whether 2 months later, they would have to be thinking about whether a presidential system was better than a parliamentary system. They would have said, let's just get through the protest. And I think in that respect, this is a moment where Egyptians across the country are absolutely starved for information. They love thinking about this. They don't know anything about parliamentary systems or presidential systems. These are not debates that had taken place in the country. So we're at a point where people simply want to know what the choices are. And there's enormous activity. I mean, at AUC, we're running public programming night after night about how you reform a constitution, or what these amendments may be, or what an electoral system looks like, or how parties are organized, and how parties may organize in different ways depending on your electoral system, and whether you have a presidential system or first past the post. And I mean, all of this is all new. So the answer is no. Nobody really has much of a conviction about what kind of system would serve them best. They're trying to figure out what systems there are, and then given what systems there are, what interests they have, and whether those interests would be better served by System A or System B or some hybrid system or something like that. The two parties that are, or the two groups that are believed to be, at the moment, the best organized are, of course, the remnants of the NDP, the ruling party, and nobody really knows what's going to happen to that, whether its remnants will be reorganized and reconstituted in something like a sort of non-communist communist party in the Eastern European terms. Will it be alive, or will it be taken apart? And the Tunisian decision to try and just completely end the life of the ruling party doesn't seem to be on the horizon in Egypt at this point, but nobody knows what's going to happen to that. It does clearly have the strongest network, grassroots support and so forth in the rural areas among the people who voted for the constitutional amendments, but that's on the docket. For all of the people who were protesters, of course, they don't have party organizations. They are not great enthusiasts for the political parties who had been the formal opposition parties, and they're trying to figure out whether they form a party, and if they form a single party, what is it about? Can they form a lot of little parties? What cost is there to them of being a lot of little parties? That may be why they want a parliamentary system, because parliamentary systems are better for lots of little parties. So all of that is completely open and completely up for grabs. And all I can say is that people are staying up all night trying to figure it out. I mean, I'd remind my Egyptian colleagues all the time of Oscar Wilde's crack, that the trouble with socialism, it takes too many evenings. Well, actually, the trouble with democratic transitions is they take too many evenings, and that's really the sort of situation people are in. I think the interesting thing about the Brotherhood is that is also the group that's said to be the best organized and so forth, with the remnants of the NDP. And I think it's pretty obvious that there are, I wouldn't even say ideological cleavages within the Brotherhood, so much as I would say there are significant generational cleavages within the Brotherhood. And those generational cleavages are not simply about, okay, the older brothers have sort of passed their prime and it's my turn, I'm now, 55. It is about what the role of the Brotherhood should be. So this becomes an intra-Brotherhood debate about politics, the Brotherhood, the aspirations of the Brotherhood, and so forth and so on. So it's easy from the outside to say they are a coherent, well-organized, and so forth and so on, but I think if you begin to look inside, they aren't so coherent, they aren't so well-organized. As a patronage network, they're fairly well-organized. I think there isn't any doubt about that, as is the NDP. So if you were doing competing patronage networks that have no real purpose in life, then I think you have these two groups and they're still fairly strong. But the NDP has been decapitated, and the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't really know who should be the head of it, if you will. So there is a lot of debate in there, and so even what we think of as the best organized are not particularly well organized. And again, they weren't prepared for this either. The Brotherhood was accustomed to being sort of cranky and out, claiming to be, if we could run, everybody would vote for us and they won't let us and so forth and so on. And now, presented with these opportunities, they're not just poised either. So it's a very interesting moment where nobody was ready for this. And everybody's scrambling to figure out how to best take advantage of opportunities they never expected to have. So it is a kind of be careful what you wish for moment in Egypt for everybody.
Okay, let's maybe take a group of questions at a time in the interest of time. If you can just state who you are and who you represent. Sir, over there, please.
Judd Harriet, documentary filmmaker. With respect to Egypt, and your comment that they are searching for alternatives, they can't quite figure out what kind of system they want. In respect to that, amendments to the Constitution seems to me to be somewhat premature. A constitution would follow this decision. So is there any kind of movement towards or discussion of a constituent assembly where they would then form a constitution based on the decision of what system they want?
Okay. Yes, please. You.
Thanks. Ruth Santini from Brookings Institution. Just a couple of, I would be very interested in your opinion on what the perceptions of the US in Egypt currently are, and whether there's a debate on how the EU and the US might help in this very delicate politically transition phase, especially related to the point you were making about the choice of political systems. Thanks.
In the back? Yes, please. Over here. Any microphone? Asil, here.
Hi, thank you for joining us. The movements in Egypt have been largely described by power of the youth. Is there something about this that challenges cultural norms of respect for the elderly and the community, the experienced in Egypt? And also, have these events in the Arab world inspired the scholarship on the region?
Please.
I'm going to take that, I'll go backwards on this because that, those are very interesting, they're all interesting questions. But first of all, on scholarship, I think most of the scholars weren't prepared for this either. So everybody's trying to get their other book finished before they start thinking about this. And a lot of the other books were about the persistence of authoritarianism, so we might just have to forget about it altogether. It is kind of interesting. I mean, nobody was prepared. The cultural norms and the youth and things, I think that this is a very interesting dynamic. One of the things that I think people don't quite appreciate here is the extent to which the parents of Egypt are proud of their children. It's astonishing. This is not seen in this country as something that was a revolution against the parents. This was a revolution on behalf of the family, if you will. It's much more, I mean, everybody I know went down to Tahrir Square to see their kids. Everybody. And across all of that kind of thing. It really is a sense that the only thing the parents will say is, we're a little guilt-ridden because we didn't do it. And we had to ask them to do it. We had to put it on our children to accomplish this. But they're hugely proud. And they really, it is. And as I said, the funny thing about education in Egypt is there's no free education. So everybody, the poorest, the richest, everybody pays for it. In a sense, this is the redemption of that. That investment has paid off. And it hasn't paid off in the sense that these kids have the jobs for which they were educated, because as you all know, the mismatch between skills and jobs and so forth and so on is still what it was on the 24th of January. But this sense that the kids did lose their fear, did represent we are going to take control again of our destiny and so forth and so on, is something that all of Egypt is proud of, all of the families are proud of. So in that sense, it doesn't seem like, you should be respectful in hierarchy, and what about the older, which is quite a significant dynamic. You're quite right about that. That may resurface, but one of the things that I think is interesting about, and I've remarked on this facetiously even in the United States about, quote, kids today, is that this is the generation that taught their parents how to program the VCR. This is the generation that has taught their parents things for decades, and the parents are used to it. Both the kids are used to it and the parents are used to it. So that sense that, I as a parent know things and you're supposed to listen to me, that dynamic has changed around the world. Everywhere in the world, that dynamic has changed. And you're even seeing it in a context where there was much more deference to the father of the family than is the case in the United States. And you still see that dynamic. So I actually think that this is something that this generation is going to be, if you will, different all the way through. It's not just that they're, the youth bulge and lots of testosterone that age and, that kind of stuff. This is a different set of responsibilities. These are, you often hear the stories of migrants in the United States that the children translated for the parents and that created a different dynamic. Well, in a sense, this entire generation around the world has translated for their parents. And so it's a very interesting dynamic. And I think in all of these places, this is part of the reason why it's happening, and it's part of the reason why we are going to have, it's going to be interesting to see how it develops. That relationship between authority and age and so forth is just different. But I have to say, one of the most becoming things about this is the extent to which the parents just think their kids are the cat's whiskers. I mean, it's adorable. Okay, perceptions of the United States, less adorable. The United States has seemed, as you undoubtedly know, from the perspective of the region, to be behind every single time, not having caught on to what was going on in Tunisia, not having caught on to what was going on in Egypt, and not having caught on to what was going on in Libya. In part because what was going on was a little bit different each time, so in fairness, you wouldn't want to necessarily extrapolate from one to the next automatically. But there are other reasons why, from the perspective of the region, the American policy statements just didn't seem like they were very agile, very quick, very informed, very knowledgeable. That may not be fair, but that's what it looks like from the region. In terms of what kinds of things the United States can be doing now, there is, as I say, again, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, and I think this is happening, so credit where it's due, this hunger for information about how politics works is quite genuine, and there are ways to address that and to answer that, which is send in people who know things like that, get those, debates going. One of the things that we've been doing at AUC, which is not American foreign policy related as such, but one of the things that everybody wants to hear is what happened in Latin America? What happened in Chile, and how did they get Pinochet? What happened after Pinochet? What happened in Eastern Europe? What happened? How did that work? Not because they think that they're like that. They don't think they're like that. But there are best practices or learned lessons or mistakes not to make that they know are around. So the more that kind of discussion and debate, particularly if it is, if I can put it this way, sort of South-South, particularly if it's not American political scientists coming in saying, you have a presidential system here and a parliamentary system. No, it's the people who are actually active in writing those constitutions, thinking about who knew the difference between Albania and Poland, and therefore would be able to say, what works here might not work in Libya. That's what's really important right now, and there is an enormous appetite for that. And I think, in some respects, that's the trouble with the evenings. The evenings are already filled up with talking to each other about what we're going to do, and then you have seminars that are bringing in people from, Hungary, and it's very busy and it's very hectic and so forth. But that kind of saying, there are ways that people have thought about these kinds of issues. They may or may not apply here, but it is worthwhile knowing about them. That's proving already to be very productive. And I think, in some respects, that sort of democracy promotion work that has been done in the past, done properly, and particularly by bringing in laterally people who have had that sort of experience, people are really hungry and interested and invigorated by that. So that sort of thing, I think, would be useful. Obviously, that will not be adequate in Libya. but it would be very helpful and instructive in Tunisia and Egypt, for example. On the question of the constitutional amendments, there was a lot of discussion about why it was, whether we should have a constituent assembly and all that sort of stuff. There was, everybody I knew was reading the Federalist Papers for about a week and a half. I mean, kind of, how do you do this? That's what I mean. This is a deeply engaged. I mean, for a political scientist, everybody in Egypt's a political scientist right now. So it's very gratifying, although I think people will fall off after a while. It does get tiresome for those of us that don't do it all the time. The part of the way the military, I think, adroitly framed all of this was after the president is elected. So you have the constitutional amendments that permit changes in the presidential term and who can run for office and so forth and so on, relatively modest changes, but do open the system for candidates who would not have been permitted under the existing constitution. Then you have those elections. You have a new parliament, because the parliament was universally understood to have been produced by rigged elections in the fall. So you need a new parliament. You need a new president, new presidential elections, so that you have, at that point, the military withdraws, they go back to the barracks, and then, if you want to talk about the Constitution again, go ahead. So it was framed that way. Nobody has said that the Constitution with these amendments is necessarily the permanent Constitution. It was just modest reforms to permit getting to the next 6 months or so. So there may be, a revisiting of all of that. There are very apropos models, very lively discussions about why it is that the American Constitution is only 6 pages long and the Egyptian Constitution is, dozens of pages long. I mean, do you want a constitution that outlines all of the rights, or says if it's not mentioned here, it's a right? There are different philosophies of constitution, so I wouldn't be surprised if those things didn't come up again, but people want to get through this transition period, and that was the plan.
Jessica?
Jessica Matthews at Carnegie Endowment. Thank you for a wonderful talk. For all we've heard and for all we've read, we still learned so much new. Listening to your description of Libya, it was hard on 2 different grounds for me to imagine a happy outcome of the intervention. Either on the grounds of the fight to the death on both sides' expectation, or on the grounds of when can Libyans manage themselves and the Western forces leave. Is that a fair set of conclusions to draw from what you said, or can you see a happier future? Thank you.
David?
David Mack from the Middle East Institute. Could you think ahead a year? Let's say we've had the political transition relatively smoothly. They've had elections, they've formed a government. What will be the top of the agenda in public debate in Egypt at that point? Will it be governance issues like corruption? Will it be bread and butter issues, jobs, high prices? Or will it be foreign policy issues, which usually comes down to being Palestine?
David Pollack?
Thank you. Dave Pollack from the Washington Institute. Thanks very much, Lisa. I wanted to ask about the military in Egypt and its views about its own longer term, or medium term at least, interests. Some people have argued, including a lot of the Tahrir Square revolutionaries, that by handing over power as quickly as it wants to do in a way that's democratic, but it may also mean that the remnants of the NDP and the Muslim Brotherhood will be the ones that the military will end up working with and is most comfortable working with, because they are, they have a head start, so to speak. Do you see the military's role in Egypt as one of, let's say, hanging on to its economic privileges, opposing worker rights, opposing serious economic reform? and so on. In other words, something that would be not that different from what we've seen up until now, despite the revolution.
And one more question. We'll have another round, but I mean, one more question in this round.
Thank you. Alan Kieswetter from the CNO Resources and the Middle East Institute. I'd like to encourage you to go back and think big. 10 years ago, you wrote an article called Arab Democracy, Dismal Prospects, that I used to assign. Well, I dug it out last week and asked my graduate students to look at it and answer the question, and ask the question, what's changed since? I think you've already suggested the social implications of technology, but could you take on the broad question?
Okay, I'll try that. But this time I'm going to get to that one last. I won't go backwards. The intervention in Libya, I do think the international community, not just the United States, was really in a very difficult position because as the tide turned against the rebels, you increasingly confronted the possibility that they would actually be defeated by the Gaddafi regime. And that would have been hugely demoralizing across the region. And it would have, I mean, it was palpable in Egypt, not that the Egyptians particularly care about Libya, or even that they particularly care about, the prospects of the protests in Libya, but they didn't want protests to be destroyed like that. They just didn't. And so there really was a sense that the protest movements in the region and, in a sort of strange bedfellows way, the governments that make up the Arab League all wanted to take this opportunity to say, no, we don't want Gaddafi to prevail. We just don't. And perhaps for different reasons, partly because people were enthused that a protest might, succeed in Libya, and some because they were just sick and tired of Gaddafi, as everybody is. But that meant that the international community was confronted by a choice of saying, we're not intervening, and the prospect that Gaddafi would have prevailed was quite high, or we are, knowing that that's going to get us into a really difficult set of dilemmas about how we get out and what happens. And since Gaddafi himself knows and has known for a long time that this was as likely an end to his regime as any other, he is actually physically, literally, personally going to be very hard to find. And people will not finish until they find him. So it could go on for a long time in that kind of stalemated house to house, so forth and so on, when nobody wants to have anything there. They're willing to drop bombs, as we've seen, but beyond that, nobody wants to do anything more. So it has come to I don't think there was any choice, honestly. I don't think that the prospect that Gaddafi would be able to destroy the rebellion and all of its supporters, which would have been a massacre, was palpable. I mean, just people couldn't do that. The problem is we now have a situation which may lead us to also palatable prospects. And I think that is a significant problem. And I had hoped, speaking of things that I had written before, that we would have been able to intervene with something more of a kind of what we hope will happen later than we did. And I understand, we're all busy and you don't have time to do all that kind of thing. But to talk a little bit about who we think will be responsible for assisting the Libyans when they start their reconstruction would have been becoming, even if it turned out we couldn't implement it. But to say something that we did not expect to be, we, the United Nations, we, the United States, we, anybody, that there was a sense that we were going to return responsibility to the Libyans, whoever they are, and we would provide some kind of assistance to them as they gathered around a table as people who have literally not talked face to face in years. And that's what it will be. It will be people from Tripoli and people from Benghazi who have not talked to each other for years and years and years. People from inside and outside who have not talked to each other for years and years and years. And somebody's going to have to be a facilitator there, frankly. But I think if we had been able to talk a little bit more about how we imagined that happening, it would have permitted us to say that, from the beginning, in good faith, we did not intend this to be anything but an effort to ensure that Gaddafi did not win. Unfortunately, right now, it's not clear what it is. So everybody's wondering about why we bothered when we're not doing it in other places, when, and so forth and so on. I think there was a legitimate, rationale for what we did when we did it, but that will get lost because we didn't really describe what we anticipated to happen afterwards. Egypt in a year. Egypt in a year will be about economic issues. I don't at that point, there will be some kind of coalescence of a political landscape. There'll be a left and a right and an NDP makeover and the Brotherhood. There will be a political landscape, and there will be those parties will be advocating policies which will mostly be about domestic economic issues. I think everybody anticipates substantial inflation. We know the stock exchange is a complete mess at this point. Tourism has disappeared entirely, so you have a huge sector with millions of people who were employed as opposed to the unemployed who are now unemployed. There's a lot to worry about in the domestic economic front, and I think there will be a lot of that. That, I think, will actually play a little bit into the military, which I'll get to in a minute. I just don't think foreign policy is going to be the principal issue unless for some reason we or somebody else decide to make it the issue. But this wasn't about foreign policy. It's still not about foreign policy. It really is about, accountable government and fairness. And a lot of the labor protests that are going on all over Egypt right now are as much, they're partly about money, but again, they're partly about dignity. You, employer, are not paying me a living wage, which is probably true. So it's as much about the right to a living wage as it is to a certain number of pounds. That will continue. And there will be lots of debates about the policies on things like what should be the minimum wage and how to accommodate the fact that, what do you do with all your unemployed, and what will the Minister of Social Solidarity be doing on welfare and so forth and so on. Keep in mind that the current Minister of Finance is actually a labor economist. And that should tell you something already about the kind of priorities that the military have. They are not interested in Washington consensus economic reform. They are not. And actually, one of the problems in Egypt, in my estimation, is if you look at the people who have been charged with corruption, some of, the former ministers and so forth, some of them are corrupt, but some of them were advocates of economic privatization. Not personally corrupt at all, taking a policy position which is now unpopular. So they've gotten caught up that this is all somehow corrupt, that big business is corrupt, and it's impossible to be a big businessman without being corrupt, and it's impossible to be a minister that was supporting business without being corrupt. So that needs to get pulled apart, and we need to take the people who are actually corrupt, of whom there were some, and disaggregate that. But I think it is an early signal of the kind of policies that the military are likely to be advocating, insofar as they advocate, for a successor regime. It's going to be about economic policy, but it's going to be a much more statist, kind of middle Mubarak era set of policies, much more about equity than growth. That serves the military purposes. I mean, they are big owners of state enterprises and so forth and so on. Why should they be interested in privatization? They're not. In addition to that, though, going beyond that a little bit, I think the military wants to be behind the curtain. They want what they were before. That worked very well. So, and they don't really care, as long as there is an implicit deal that they can stay behind the curtain and stay what they were before. They don't care what goes on. They don't care who the government is, as long as those prerogatives are not challenged. And to tell you the truth, I think the vast majority of people are perfectly content with that. Even the people in Tahrir Square, they realized that an embrace of the military was pretty much all they had. So those are the ones who were climbing on the tanks, kissing everybody. Those people are also willing to say, okay, get back behind the curtain. Let us debate everything else. There's plenty else to debate. And someday in the future, the question of military prerogatives may come up, but not for now. And I think that would be a perfectly reasonable resolution by the lights of most people. Now, obviously, there are a few intellectuals who are going to push this, but by and large, people would be content with that because there are lots of other issues that can be, free expression and issues of, labor rights and wages and all that kind. There's lots of other stuff to discuss in Egypt before you start saying, the military has a big chunk of the economy. So I think that's what they want, and if they get it, they're pretty liberal.
Okay, gentleman in the back there. So, oh, you're.
Hmm?
My question about what's changed.
Oh, right. I skipped it, didn't I? A Freudian slip if ever there was one. I do think it's partly the maturation of this generation, I have to say. When we were thinking about, that these regimes were getting sort of long in the tooth, and we were thinking it about 10 or 15 years ago, suggesting they had gotten very long in the tooth by now, we were sort of speculating about the next generation and who would be the people who would come up and so forth. And that was the era when Saif al-Islam Gaddafi and Gamal Mubarak and, so forth and so on, all of these people. And one of the things that we used to talk about Ben Ali didn't have a son who would serve that same purpose and all that kind of stuff. That seemed to be kind of the inevitable transfer of power. There didn't seem to be any other way it would happen. How you would get to the next generation was only through this quasi-monarchical way, which nobody thought was satisfying, nobody thought really would work, but there didn't seem to be a way to get to what turns out to be the next generation. So one of the things that's interesting here is across all of these three countries, and I would argue that this is true in the region as a whole, there is the lost generation of the parents. And they're going to have to concede, in a sense. And this gets to this, is it my turn because I'm now old enough to do it, or am I simply going to say, the kids can do it for us? But that generation that is between 82 and 32 is just stuck. They didn't figure out how to do it themselves. And they are probably, in a surprising way, going to have to concede to their kids. Hmm?
Something like Prince Charles.
Yes, like Prince Charles. Exactly.
I'm Ibrahim Hussein. I live here in Washington, D.C. I'm an Egyptian American. I'm one of these parents. I am giving up to my kids and grandchildren. I mean, they are just the future. I'm so delighted with what they have done. I have a question about possible hijacking. Is it, I mean, we are not there yet. We are not done. There's a lot of groups and have been mentioned. Is it possible that we will get drifted from true democracy to some hijacking? And I'd like to get your opinion of this. I'm delighted that you feel optimistic about the future of Egypt. I'm glad to hear that. The other question, as an Egyptian American, what can we do to help? Thank you.
Yes, please.
İlhan Tanır from Vatan and Hürriyet Daily News from Turkish Press. Quick couple of questions. First of all, why the latest referenda, why there was the participation of the referenda was so low? I believe it was mid-40s. Could you please elaborate on that after this excitement? And second is, Secretary of State Clinton was there just last week, and one of the group of the youth movement rejected meeting with her. Was it a reflection of a deeper sentiment among the Egyptian youth? Is there a real deep grudge against the U.S. for the last 3 decades or 5 decades, or it was just temporary? And the last question is, you talk about some models, Latin American models and other models, whether Turkey could be modeled as a Muslim majority country and democracy was a topic, was entertained in Washington and Turkey. Would you please touch on that, if it was a realist approach from inside of
Yes,
Egypt?
sir,
Thank you.
please.
My name is Kani Zulam. I'm with the American Kurdish Information Network. In 2003, a document was discovered in the headquarters of, intelligence headquarters of Saddam Hussein's Baghdad, that 13 Kurdish women were sent to Egypt to its brothels. The parents of these women appealed to the First Lady of Egypt, Suzanne Mubarak, and unfortunately their appeal fell to deaf ears. How transparent is the new Egypt? Do you think something could be discovered about these women?
One last question. Yes, sir, please. Over.
Samah Alphonse from the Arab League. Thank you, Lisa, for your sharing with us. In your capacity of as a head of the American University in Cairo, and the current change now, and especially that most of the people who carried the revolution was the young people. And do you see there is anti-American sentiment in the street? And what do you see the role of the American University in the upcoming 2-3 years regarding the change in Egypt?
Okay. I'm going to start with that last one. I'll give you my inaugural address. No. I think AUC, well, first of all, I do not think, despite the fact that the youth group did not meet with Secretary Clinton and so forth and so on, I do not see a lot of anti-American sentiment in this. This is intra-Egyptian. It is about relations between governments and citizens. Over the course of time, as policy positions begin to congeal a little bit, I suppose, just as with economic policy, you will see foreign policy positions and so forth and so on, but it really is not about that. And I don't think in any of these countries at this point, that's what the principal question is. I do think that one of the things that, you know, I'll brag a minute about AUC because I'm paid to, but also because I would anyway. I think we, as an institution, have played a hugely important role in promoting the kind of education for citizenship, which is what animates these kinds of movements. So without saying that other kinds of education are not also important, I think the idea that a liberal arts education, which encourages critical thinking, which encourages people to ask questions and think nimbly and so forth, creates better citizens. And I think much of that sentiment and impulse and spirit was evident in not only in the protests, but in their effective management and the relationship between many of the leaders of the movement with the wise men, if you will, who negotiated with the government and so forth and so on. So I think there's enormous opportunity for us to continue playing that kind of role in a new Egypt. I think it's actually going to be easier to do that than it had been in the past. It will be amplified through free expression and so forth in a way that it wasn't before. So from my vantage point, the kinds of values that AUC represents should be even more deeply appreciated and embedded in the society. So as you can tell, I'm very optimistic. One small gesture that we've made to this end in the short run is AUC is governed by a protocol that was signed in the early 1970s between the Egyptian government and the American government. And one of its provisions is that AUC has a position at the university called the University Counselor, who is the liaison to the Egyptian government. We have had for the last 3 years a university counselor who has, among many other things, watched the university do a search for a new president and sort of seen how an American university routinely operates. He's now on public service leave, an idea that's new to Egypt, as the Minister of Higher Education. So we hope that the experience of seeing from the inside the workings of a genuinely not-for-profit private institution and so forth will have some utility to him as he thinks about the fact that all of the national universities are now in an uproar because the students want all of the presidents and deans removed because they were all appointed by the President of the Republic. That is Mubarak. So how do you design a mechanism for the selection of presidents and deans? Well, it probably won't be constitute a board of trustees and have them run a search for the president, which is obviously what AUC did, but something different from simply saying the president names these people is likely to come out of that. So I think in lots of ways like that, large and small, we will prove to be contributing to the capacity to think about different ways of doing things. From the political science on we can talk, we can bring experts on parliamentary systems and presidential systems to the way we operate, the way we run our own affairs might be useful examples to consider as we go forward. And so I think AUC represents an opportunity, a resource for Egypt now, even more than it did in the past. And I hope we fulfill those expectations. The Kurdish women question, actually, I don't obviously know the answer about that particular case. I had not heard about it before, but the larger question about transparency, I think, is a very interesting one, because I think there is the intent to be a much more transparent government, even in this transition period, than had been the case before. But note that for all intents and purposes, all of the files of the Interior Ministry have been burned. There have been fires in the Interior Ministry and in local state security offices all over the country. And the reason we know about the Interior Ministry is that it's a block and a half away from our downtown campus. And so we are constantly having to reroute our buses and so forth because there's a fire at the Interior Ministry. The upshot, however, is that there has clearly been an effort on probably a number of parties' parts to destroy evidence. Now, and some of the Tahrir protesters did put out some of those fires and did try and get some of that evidence and so forth. But it's interesting, it's not even clear altogether who's been lighting the fires, because there are disaffected police who were fired and went back in and started some of the fires, and then there are probably security people in the employ of the Interior Ministry who are destroying evidence. That's what many of the protesters think. In any event, this is part of one of those transitions questions. The extent to which you have a capacity for documenting a truth and reconciliation and so forth and so on. I mean, part of the point of burning all of that evidence is making it harder to do that. So it may be that going forward, you have a much more transparent, bureaucratic, ordinary, if you will, kind of administrative apparatus, but it's not clear that that kind of administrative apparatus will be able to recoup the past. And the question of the past and who should be brought to justice is, in fact, a very complicated, murky one. So I think, as I say, that particular case may have been lost in the fires. Other ones like that may have been lost in the fires, but we will never know. There was some recuperation of some of this material, and some of it had been shredded, and we were kind of facetiously talking about the fact that, as happened in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, there are a lot of unemployed students that can piece together all the shredded material. That may happen in some circumstances, but the stuff that's burned is burned, so I don't know what will happen. Turkey as a model is something that you hear a lot, actually, in the United States. You don't hear it so much in Egypt because I don't think they want to have any single model. This is going to be an Egyptian project, so they want to take a little bit from Chile and a little bit from Turkey and a little bit from, somewhere else and so forth and so on, and construct something that's Egyptian. It may borrow disproportionately from one country or another, but people are starting to say, well, what happened in Indonesia? What happened in other places? So being Muslim majority clearly would matter, and that's why people are asking about Indonesia. But at this point, there is no sense of, okay, this country shows us our future. And I think that's quite deliberate on the part of those people who are trying to sort out what kinds of policy and procedures they want to advocate. The question of the youth and Mrs. Clinton, I actually didn't put much import in that. I think it is clear that Mrs. Clinton's visit was not particularly well organized, and so the figuring out beforehand who would be willing and able to meet with her and that kind of thing didn't happen. It didn't happen, and so some of that, you know, they left themselves open to apparently being disrespected, if you will. But I don't know that there's anything deeper to read into that at this juncture. In any event. On the issue of the turnout for the constitutional referendum, the mid-40s may not sound like a lot to you, but since the turnout for the parliamentary elections in the fall was 5%, mid-40s is pretty high. And in fact, it was viewed as very high. People were very, very happy. There were all these people who said, you know, I haven't voted in 40 years, I never voted before, I'm, you know, and so forth and so on. So it may not have been 100%. It may not, you know, but in many of the rural areas, I think the get out the vote mechanisms didn't actually operate. And most of the people who voted actually wanted to vote. And the interesting thing is, they all said one of the things that was fun about voting is they didn't know how it was going to come out. Yeah. So I actually think everybody believes that the turnout was pretty high, and it was a very satisfying experience for those who enjoyed it. As far as what Egyptian Americans can do now, I think there is a very important Egyptian diaspora, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere as well. And I think this is a time where it is valuable to people in Egypt to see that reconnection, to see people making investments. And that can be investments of time. It doesn't have to be investments of money at this juncture, although I mean, I'm, you know, not again, being a little facetious, I'm sort of a value investor. I mean, I think Warren Buffett is right, and boy, are there values in Egypt now. If I were an investor, I'd be going into Egypt and picking up these properties, because give me 5 or 10 years, I'd be a millionaire. I mean, so, and I think that's true literally economically about business, but I also think it's true in general. This is such a good time to make investments, as I say, of time, of expertise, of commitment, of moral support, of, you know, whatever kind of resources you have. This is a great moment to say, yes, this whole community of what is estimated to be 8 million Egyptians living overseas, who knows, to have that be part of these conversations and be part of the networks and so forth and so on. People in Egypt love that. They love to know that people are paying attention and caring and so forth. So whatever your particular resources are, they would be welcome back in Egypt at this juncture.
Well, on this very upbeat note, I think you will all agree that we've just heard a very engaging and quite insightful presentation. So please join me in thanking Dr. Anderson for this lovely event.